Hi, it's Gita, and this is Swamp Watch. The major legislative votes in the U.S. Congress this week centered entirely around ending the 43-day-long federal government shutdown, which was the longest in history. The critical measure that was passed by both chambers was titled the Continuing Appropriations, Agriculture, Legislative Branch, Military Construction, and Veterans Affairs and Extensions Act of 2026. The beginning of the end for this government shutdown occurred on November 10th, when the Senate first invoked cloture and then passed a bipartisan bill to end the shutdown by a vote of 60-40. The passing votes were secured when 8 Democrats and 1 independent defied their party leadership and voted to end the shutdown, even though the measure failed to include an extension of the Obamacare tax credits, which then, of course, resulted in double-digit increases in Obamacare premiums or Affordable Care Act premiums for 2026 for most participants. When the bill passed in the Senate, Speaker Mike Johnson finally recalled the House of Representatives, and this paved the way for them to vote on the amended measure on November 12th, where it passed by a vote of 222 to 209. Once the bill had been passed in both chambers of Congress, of course, it went to President Trump to be signed later that same day, November 12th, and the shutdown officially ended. So what passed was not a full annual budget. What was passed is a temporary measure, a continuing resolution, which allows most federal agencies to continue to function through January 30th, 2026. It did include full-year funding for 3 appropriations bills: the Agriculture, Rural Development, and Food and Drug Administration bill. The legislative branch was fully funded, and a full-year appropriations bill for military construction and Veterans Affairs was passed. The remainder of the bill is a temporary compromise. Congress is going to have to continue to haggle over full-year appropriation bills for the remaining functions in government. The amended bill that was passed by the Senate and then subsequently passed by the House reverses the mass firings of federal workers and prevents against any additional layoffs, at least until that January 30th, 2026 deadline. The core policy conflict that Democrats were holding out for was extension of the Affordable Care Act premium tax credits, which is important to many of their constituents, both Republican and Democratic constituents. That issue didn't get resolved in this vote, but what they did commit to in exchange for their votes, the 8 Democrats and the 1 independent, was a guarantee that they would hold a separate vote on the premium tax credits no later than December, so sometime next month. So many people were unhappy with the way this whole thing played out. Republican voters said that Democrats wasted time and created this whole long, protracted shutdown for nothing. They didn't get anything. They could have just voted for this months ago. Many Democratic voters felt betrayed, that Democrats caved in. Other people felt like somebody had to end the shutdown because people were being hurt. And so some Democrats stepped forward and said, we don't like it, but we're going to vote for it, and we're going to try and tackle this another way. I'm curious to know what you think about this. Who was responsible for the government shutdown in the first place? Was it Republicans by refusing to work in a bipartisan manner and by refusing to compromise, or was it Democrats for holding on to an issue and trying to use the shutdown as leverage to get Republicans to vote for one of their policy priorities, which ultimately wasn't successful, but was it the right strategy? What do you think? Democrats or Republicans were responsible for the shutdown? Let us know. The Supreme Court also had a pretty active week last week, the 10th through the 16th of November, including one ruling on same-sex marriage, which was pretty consequential. You might remember the name Kim Davis. This was the Kentucky County clerk who was refusing to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples on the basis that it violated her religious beliefs. Ultimately, she lost that case, and in a now precedential landmark case, Obergefell versus Hodges, same-sex couples were guaranteed the right to marry legally. As a consequence of that suit, a lower court ordered Kim Davis to pay damages and attorney's fees for the gay couple who had been denied their marriage license. And the case that just came to the Supreme Court was her appeal of that decision. But what the Supreme Court did is rejected the appeal without hearing any oral arguments, meaning the lower court order requiring her to pay damages stands, and effectively signaling that there's really no appetite at the Supreme Court level right now to revisit the decision on same-sex marriage or to overturn that precedent that was set by that previous case. The Supreme Court also heard oral arguments in a case called Lander versus Louisiana Department of Corrections. In this case, an individual, a prison guard in Louisiana, forced a Rastafarian man to shave his head, which violated his religious beliefs. And that case centers around whether that individual person, that prison guard, can be held liable for violating that person's rights, or whether the state's immunity principles for incarceration apply in this case, and that they have to stop the practice, but no damages or restitution is due to the victim. The Supreme Court also heard arguments in the case Fernandez versus the United States and Rutherford versus the United States. These consolidated cases relate to the Armed Career Criminal Act, or ACCA, which imposes a mandatory minimum sentence for certain federal firearm offenses if the defendant has 3 prior convictions for a violent felony, after a series of Supreme Court rulings in recent years which have sort of narrowed that definition. On the presidential front, it's been busy. That's really an understatement. Of course, the topic dominating the news is the Epstein files and the congressional feud over releasing those Epstein files, including President Trump's intense pressure campaign to try to get Republican members of Congress to vote against the release of those files. That vote is expected at the very beginning of this next week, the week of November 17th. So that won't necessarily be the end of the saga, but the next play in this whole long, drawn-out drama will happen in the coming couple of days. Another, somewhat surprising development has been the U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean. The U.S. Navy's newest and largest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, has entered the area of responsibility of the U.S. Southern Command, which oversees Latin America and the Caribbean. And this represents a pretty significant escalation of the tensions between Venezuela and the United States. Venezuela has mobilized their own troops in response to this move, and then the U.S. responded to that by designating Venezuela's Cartel de los Soles as a terrorist organization. So this is a developing story, and we'll see what happens next week. President Trump also went on a very surprising pardon spree, or maybe not surprising, depending on your point of view. He has issued dozens of pardons in recent weeks for MAGA loyalists, for former business associates, and political allies. Lots of people with either political or financial ties to the president himself, which has prompted warnings from legal scholars about potential corrupt pay-to-play schemes going on with the president's pardon power. The Trump administration also launched a really direct attack on the Customer Financial Protection Bureau last week, arguing in a court filing that the agency's funding mechanism is unlawful and that it will exhaust its funding in early 2026, at which point they're arguing it should be dismantled entirely. On the immigration front, the Trump administration launched a new surge of activity in Charlotte, North Carolina. They're calling it Charlotte's Web. Its targeting of immigrants living in Charlotte, North Carolina has drawn a sharp rebuke from local government officials, including Charlotte's mayor, who said that the actions are causing unnecessary fear and uncertainty in the local community. And finally, on the tariff front, we're still awaiting a ruling by the Supreme Court on whether President Trump's use of emergency powers to enact his sweeping tariffs are even legal. But in the meantime, President Trump has had to give in the face of public pressure and backlash over escalating food prices. On Friday, President Trump issued an executive order exempting many food commodities from these sweeping tariffs that he's enacted. And this includes beef, coffee, bananas, and other food items, which are no longer subject to his country-specific tariffs. What happened in the federal government last week? This coming week is shaping up to be a very busy week, so stay tuned to Swamp Watch, and we'll update you on everything that happened in the federal government.